Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here for Dr. Geeta Persad's seminar. So if you guys don't know already, Dr. Geeta Persad is an assistant professor at the Earth and Planetary Science Department. Is that what it's called now?
That is what it's called now, yes.
Down on main campus. And she's really been a leader in expanding our knowledge of aerosols in our atmosphere and their impacts on both regional and global hydroclimate. And really that expertise started back in her bachelor's. She did her BS at Stanford in geophysics, and she had a thesis on black carbon impacts on our climate. So it's gone way back, her expertise. After her bachelor's, she went on to Princeton to get her master's and PhD in atmospheric and ocean sciences. And there she also got a certificate in science, technology, and policy. So she's also very integrated in policy world, and a lot of her research does inform policy. And that's very evident. After that, she went back to Stanford to the Carnegie Institute, where she did a postdoc and then also was a research associate there. And that's where I actually met Geeta and was very impressed by her then, and still am very impressed by her today. I was a graduate student then. During her time in the Bay Area, she also worked for the Union of Concerned Scientists. And a lot of her work there was looking at California's water security, bless you. And I was trying to help understand California's water future and water security. And so her work has been really important for policy and decision making in terms of climate adaptation and mitigation. And her work has been featured in multiple media outlets. And she's also been cited in the IPCC report. So she's also helped creating this body of scientific knowledge that is being used for policy. And Geeta has also been honored with a bunch of awards. Most recently, I won't go through them all because there was a whole page on her CV, but most recently, she's been named a Generation Climate Leader by the Environmental Defense Fund. And she also won a Rising Stars Faculty Awards here at UT Austin. So I'm very excited to see your talk today. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thanks so much, Danielle. And thanks everybody for coming. It's such a joy to get to come north and hang out with UTIG folks. My talk today will hopefully bring together some of the themes in my past work that Danielle mentioned. So I kind of cut my teeth thinking about the role of aerosols in climate, and I'll talk a little bit about what aerosols are and why we care about them. But then really throughout my career, I've been thinking a lot about how we use climate science and how we use particularly climate projection data in decision making. And I think what I'm going to be presenting today is kind of a convergence of those two themes. So thinking about how a lot of the fundamental science that we've learned about the role of aerosols in the climate system over the last 10 or 15 years that I've been in the field now should be informing the way that we are making decisions around climate risk, around climate planning, around climate mitigation and adaptation. So what I hope to convince you of today is that anthropogenic aerosols are actually a major driver of climate risk, and that the community of people that are thinking about climate risk assessment, whether it's at the local scale with city planners or at the national or international scale, really need to be integrating anthropogenic aerosols into how they think about the climate problem writ large. So first, I just want to orient us a little bit on what I mean when I say aerosols. Even if this is something that you've maybe heard about before, I feel like it's useful to actually put this in terms of things that we actually think about on maybe a more daily basis. So aerosols are really just referring to this sort of miasma of liquid and solid particles in the atmosphere. And they can have both natural and anthropogenic sources. And it's really just made up of some of these individual species of aerosols that are shown here. So this is showing you just a snapshot of the distribution of aerosols in the atmosphere, separated by species. So in orange is dust, dust is an aerosol in the atmosphere, right? And so you can see you have lots of natural sources of dust coming off of the arid regions of the world. There's also arguably an anthropogenic component of dust from urbanization and aridification. In green is what's called black or organic carbon. And this is essentially the stuff that comes from incomplete combustion, so soot. And this can have both natural and anthropogenic components. So you can see that there's a lot of this black and organic carbon coming off of a lot of the areas where there's a lot of seasonal agriculture and also a lot of biomass. So biomass burning is a major source of black and organic carbon aerosol, and that can be either natural or anthropogenic in origin. But black and organic carbon is also a characteristic emission from a lot of industrial processes, particularly in the developing world. So you can see some of that happening in South and East Asia. And then the other major industrial aerosol is sulfate, which is shown in white across this map. And so you can see there's a lot of industrial sulfate coming from South and East Asia, as well as a fair amount in North America and Europe. This is a very strange pointer. I think I may be standing in the wrong place. Okay. The other primarily natural aerosol that we think about is sea salt, which is shown in light blue on this map. Let's see. Oh, can I use the mouse to point? Yeah, that might be a little more intuitive for me. I may do that. Okay, so you can see there's a lot of sea salt that's emitted across the Southern Ocean. This is basically wind-driven emission of sea salt from breaking waves in the ocean. So all of these particles make up what we talk about as aerosol in the atmosphere. And these aerosol particles impact the climate system primarily through their interaction with solar radiation or sunlight. And they do that both directly through the interaction of individual particles with sunlight, but also in the way that they affect the properties of clouds. So one way that aerosols interact really strongly with sunlight is by directly scattering incoming solar radiation. So sulfate aerosols, sea salt, most forms of dust do this. So this is showing you sort of schematically on the left what a sort of miasma of aerosols over a region would do. So they tend to block incoming solar radiation and therefore cool the region directly underneath where they're located. But at a global scale, they have a cooling effect on the climate by basically reducing the net incoming solar radiation. However, there are other species of aerosols that actually absorb incoming solar radiation. So black carbon, some types of dust, depending on composition and size, may actually absorb incoming solar radiation. And this can have much more complex impacts on climate. So in the region where the aerosol itself is located, you can get an effect where the aerosol is absorbing solar radiation and heating up the layer of the atmosphere that it's located in. But then immediately below it, it's reducing the amount of energy coming in. So you can get this sort of dipole effect. I do not want to update now. You can get this sort of dipole effect where you have heating in the atmosphere and cooling at the surface, which can produce all sorts of complicated, particularly hydroclimate responses. But when we think about the sort of net global effect on the energy balance, these absorbing aerosol types tend to have a warming influence on the climate system. Now, aerosols can also impact the climate system through their interactions with clouds. So aerosol particles are actually one of the reasons why we have the distribution of clouds that we have on planet Earth. So aerosol particles are really critical for forming the nucleus of clouds. And actually, without those aerosol particles for water vapor to condense onto, it'd be really hard to get over the thermodynamic barrier for cloud formation. So naturally occurring aerosols have actually been a critical part of cloud formation on Earth going back pre-industrially. But what we've seen as we've added more and more of these pollutants to the atmosphere is that we're essentially we have more surfaces for clouds to nucleate on. And so what that means is that you might go from a cloud that looks something like this, you have some aerosol particles in it, and you have a certain amount of water in the cloud that's distributed among those particles. And then if you go to a more polluted atmosphere and you've now added more nuclei, you are essentially taking that same water and distributing it across a larger number of smaller droplets. So what that means is that you're actually increasing the reflective surface area in your cloud, and that makes the clouds more reflective and is actually one of the larger cooling influences on climate that aerosols produce. So in net, all of the anthropogenic sources of aerosols have a cooling effect on climate through both this direct scattering and also through their influence on clouds. But there's a substantial amount of absorption that happens as well. And so you can imagine when you start thinking about things like the precipitation response in a specific region to this aerosol pollution, it can get extremely complex. So I want to give you all just a little sampling of the types of aerosol research that my group is doing here, because I won't have a chance to go into all of it in detail, but I want to give you sort of the Twitter version, if we're still allowed to say that, of the work that some of the graduate students in my group are doing. And if any of this is particularly interesting to you, I encourage you to track these people down. They love to talk about their research. So I'll give you all just a very quick preview. So one of the questions that my PhD student, Sebastian Utama, is thinking about is the role of wildfire aerosol in climate, and particularly how changes in the temporal variability of wildfire emissions affects climate. And so what this graph is showing you is the effect on surface temperature that you get from taking the same time averaged amount of wildfire emissions, but changing it from being very smooth through time to being very variable through time. And it turns out that just that shift from smooth emissions to variable emissions produces its own climate signal, which is a little bit troubling because we don't have very good observations of what wildfire emissions have been going back beyond the satellite era. And so this is actually a big question in the climate community right now. Are we representing these emissions properly? And so Sebastian's work has showed that you do get this climate signal just from changing the temporal variability in wildfire emissions, but it's actually for different reasons than a lot of people in the community had thought. So a lot of interesting stuff that he's unpacking there. Another one of my students, Kayla White, has been thinking about how these radiative effects of aerosols change depending on the climate state that we're in. So I talked about how aerosols reflect or absorb incoming solar radiation and also interact with clouds. And so you might think, well, does the effect that a given amount of aerosol have on the climate depend on how much cloud we have in our background climate state or how much radiation different parts of the Earth are receiving? And so Kayla has done some simulations that try to sort of test this. And essentially what I'm showing you here is on the left-hand side is a measure of aerosols' effect on the energy balance in a pre-industrial climate. So if you take a chunk of aerosol and you put it into a pre-industrial climate, this is the sort of effect on the energy balance. And on the right-hand side is the effect on the energy balance in a present-day climate. And all you really need to take away from this is that these two bar graphs look pretty much the same. So they're more or less statistically indistinguishable, which is not what we were expecting going into that project. So this is something that Kayla has been digging into quite a bit. So the answer to that question, we think, is probably not, for reasons that we're still trying to understand. And then my other PhD student, Veronica Rodensek, has been thinking about how aerosol forcing interacts with other forms of anthropogenic forcing, particularly irrigation, which has increasingly been recognized as a human influence on the climate system. And one of the things she's been looking at is how aerosols and irrigation interact over South Asia, which is one of the parts of the world that has both really high air pollution and really high rates of irrigation. And so what this is actually showing you is the effect on the amount of solar radiation reaching the surface over South Asia in a situation where you have both the aerosol loading over that region and the irrigation over that region being simulated simultaneously versus if you simulate them separately and then add the effects together. And so what you're seeing here is basically the nonlinear interactions between aerosols and irrigation. And you can see that you get about 10 watts per meter squared in nonlinear effects from the interactions of these forcings. And so this is really demonstrating that we have to be thinking about some of these sort of non-greenhouse gas forcings on the climate system a little bit more critically. So snapshot of what the group does, and you might be thinking to yourself, well, why do they spend so much time thinking about aerosols? This is a lot of person power to put to just thinking about these little particles in the atmosphere. And the reason that we think about we spend so much time thinking about these aerosols is that aerosols have had a major influence on the evolution of climate globally, regionally, and also locally over the historical period. So this figure is showing just one of many studies that have taken the historical evolution of global mean temperature, which is what's shown here in black. This is actually work by Clara Desser, who gave the UTIG seminar not that long ago. And they've taken this historical evolution and they've decomposed it into the contribution from anthropogenic greenhouse gas changes through time versus anthropogenic aerosol changes through time. So the red line here is showing you the effect of anthropogenic greenhouse gas. The blue line is showing you the effect of anthropogenic aerosol. And what we see from studies like this is that anthropogenic aerosol has actually offset around a third to a half of the warming from greenhouse gases over the industrial period. So a very large impact on overall global mean temperature change. And you can see that it's also really affected the sort of temporal evolution of warming. So it's delayed sort of the emergence of a detectable human signal on global mean climate. And then when we start to think about more regional signals and impacts on things like hydroclimate, the effect of the aerosol can actually become dominant. So here I'm showing you the evolution of South Asian monsoon rainfall over the sort of industrial era. And the color bar is a little bit different here, but the blue now is the historical evolution of that. And so you can see that there was a period from the 1950s onward where there was actually a sort of collapse of South Asian monsoon precipitation that was really troubling. And when climate scientists decompose that historical evolution into the contribution, again here from greenhouse gas in red and now aerosol in black, you can see that most of the time evolution of the precipitation anomalies over South Asia is driven by the aerosol forcing. So when we start thinking about regional hydroclimate, this aerosol forcing can actually be a more important anthropogenic forcing than the greenhouse gas. And then lastly, even when we zoom into the local scale, local aerosol loadings can play a big role in sort of synoptic scale weather systems. So this is just showing one case study from a major convective storm in Houston, where the researchers simulated the behavior of the storm sort of in the actual observed conditions, and then ran a simulation where they took the local aerosol loading out of the model and tried to reproduce the storm. And basically what you can see here is the redder colors are showing you really intense storm activity. And so you can just see that the presence of the aerosol basically invigorates the storm. So without the aerosol, that storm would actually be weaker. So we see these effects of the aerosol on climate and weather at global, regional, local scales. And this is particularly important to be thinking about because the effect, the sort of total amount of aerosols that we're putting into the atmosphere has been highly variable over the historical period, but also is extremely uncertain, oh no, going forward in time. So what this is showing you is the evolution of black carbon aerosol here on the left. So again, this is that sort of soot combustion aerosol. And then sulfur dioxide aerosol, which is the sulfate, that really potent scattering aerosol type. The brown line is showing you the historical evolution and then one of the future projections of how those emissions might evolve. And then the other colors are showing you the sort of standard scenarios of how these emissions might evolve going through 2100. And what you can take away from this is if you think about just sort of the next 30 years, so going out to 2050, this range of uncertainty in what aerosol emissions are going to look like by mid-century is as large as the entire growth that we've seen over the industrial era, right? So if we think about the effect that growth has had on climate at all of these scales, it should be somewhat concerning to us that we're not sure which of these paths we're going to be following over the next 30 years, right? And so when you look at what is actually going to drive uncertainty in climate over the next 30 years, especially at the regional scale, there's an argument that we're still trying to wrap our heads around that the aerosol is actually a bigger driver of that uncertainty than is the greenhouse gas trajectory. So given all of this sort of framework, there's been a group of us in the climate science community who have been trying to sort of issue a call to action to the broader climate world to be thinking more critically about the role of anthropogenic aerosols in all of these impacts that we have started to consider more seriously when it comes to climate change. So in a pair of papers that came out over the last year and a half or so, we published some commentaries that were sort of a call to action for the climate science community, the climate services community, which is sort of the niche of people who are producing data that's then used by stakeholders, and then also sort of the decision-making community that's actually executing plans based on all of this climate data. And the main message that we were trying to convey with this is that aerosols really have to be considered in the way that we do climate risk assessments. So the storyline that we put forward in these studies and that I hope to convince you of today is that aerosols have been major drivers of past climate changes. Hopefully I've convinced you of that now. And they're also a major uncertainty in near-term climate forcing, right? So over the next 30 years, we have this massive range in what the aerosols may do. But what I want to try to show you some examples of going forward is that aerosols' influence on climate change and climate impacts and climate risk have a lot of really substantial differences from greenhouse gases in ways that we need to be thinking about and how we characterize climate risk. And the way that we've actually built our climate risk assessments right now is very much structured around the effects of greenhouse gases on climate. And so what I want to show you is a few examples of ways in which that framework really fails when we're trying to think about the climate influence of aerosols. And so hopefully by the end, I will have convinced you that neglecting aerosols is a big gap in the way that we're doing climate risk assessment. So one of the big things, just starting with this concept that aerosols' influence on climate is very different than greenhouse gases. I've kind of highlighted already the fact that, in net, aerosols cool climate as opposed to warming climate. They also have this different temporal evolution through time. But one of the big differences is that aerosols' influence on climate is very heterogeneous compared to greenhouse gases. And similar to the residence time of snacks on main campus versus at UTIG, the residence time of aerosols in the atmosphere is much shorter than the residence time in the atmosphere of greenhouse gases. Yes, call back to snack discussion. Thank you. So what that means is that the aerosols don't have very much time to get far from where they were emitted. And so that creates a very patchy structure of influence on climate that is distinct from greenhouse gases, which are generally uniform. So one way that we see that come up in this idea of climate impacts and climate risk is that aerosols tend to be co-located by nature of their sources with many of the most populated regions of the world. So what this graph map is showing you is the sort of time average distribution of aerosols in the atmosphere. Darker colors is more aerosol. And this is overlaid with regions hatched in green here where we have population density of more than 100 people per square kilometer. So you can really see, right, especially South and East Asia, you have very high aerosol loading, very high population, but this is true in other parts of the world as well. And this is also just over the roughly the last 5 years. The distribution of people and emissions has changed a lot over time. But because aerosols tend to come from industrial sources, they tend to be happening wherever people are living, right? And wherever infrastructure is located. And so to the extent that aerosols' impact on climate is co-located with where the aerosols themselves are, you're going to get this co-location of climate hazard with climate exposure, right? You're going to get this co-location of the actual physical climate system effect with where things that could actually be impacted by those climate changes are going to be located. Now, I said to the extent that where aerosols are dictates where their climate effect is happening. Aerosols are not only a problem for the places where they're located. One of the side effects of having a spatial distribution that's this patchy is that you can set off these teleconnected impacts in the climate system. And so that's something that we see very strongly with aerosols. So this is a schematic that sort of summarizes the consensus understanding of the teleconnected effects of some of the big aerosol changes that we've seen over the historical period. And so I'll just draw your attention first to sort of the purple parts of this graphic. So this is showing you the effect of aerosol increases in Europe that were dominant over most of the industrial era up until around the 1970s, 1980s, when European clean air regulations came into full effect. And what studies have shown is that that increase in European aerosols over that time period contributed to Arctic cooling really strongly, and it also contributed to hydroclimate effects in places as far off as South and East Asia, and also the Sahel. So some recent studies have identified that a major drought that happened in the Sahel during the 1980s and associated famine that came along with that is largely attributable to the increase in European aerosols and the effect that that very sort of hitting the climate system with that big hammer in one location had these teleconnected effects on rainfall in other places. And then the green parts of this graphic are highlighting the teleconnected effect of the Asian aerosol increases that we've seen over the last few decades. And those also have very wide-ranging impacts. So both India and China have seen big increases in aerosol emissions over the last 30, 40 years. That has impacted circulation across the whole tropical Pacific. So it's had the effect of invigorating this sort of classical tropical east to west circulation that we get across the equator. And you can see that the effect is to increase precipitation in the Western Pacific, but actually suppress precipitation in the Eastern Pacific and other parts of the Pacific Rim, as well as in the Western Indian Ocean. So this is just to kind of drive home this fact that aerosol emissions in one location are not only a problem for that location, they also are going to affect climate conditions in another place. So one would hope, right, given all of these factors, that we would be accounting for these dynamics of aerosols' influence on climate appropriately in our climate risk assessment frameworks. And I wouldn't be here if I didn't think the answer to that was probably not. So what I want to kind of walk you guys through now is what the standard framework for climate risk assessment looks like right now, and how the way that has been built to think about greenhouse gas-driven climate change creates these sort of blind spots for thinking about the influence of aerosols. So when we think about how climate risk assessments usually develop, generally they start with Earth system model projections, right? So Earth system models, I think there have been there's lots of people at UTIG that work with these and have been a few talks on this, but we're essentially just simulating all of the known physics of the Earth system and using it to run scenarios in our models that we can't run in the real world. And so these Earth system models produce these climate projection data sets that are basically the basis for every quantitative climate risk assessment. But when you think about the type of climate risk assessment that is actually affecting, say, policy decisions, there's a very long path from the Earth system models producing these climate projections to somebody actually making a decision based on climate risk. So an example of a decision based on climate risk might be something like a local city planner here in Austin deciding how big we need to make our storm drains to handle the amount of water that's going to be coming through them in the future, right? Or another example might be the federal government has to put a price on the social cost of carbon in order to decide whether different regulations are cost effective, things like that. So, and all of those use Earth system model projections as an input, but in getting from the Earth system models to the climate risk assessment, there's a lot of steps. So if you are, say, a local planner, you might take these Earth system model projections and run them through, say, a regional climate model, which is a much more high resolution, spatially restricted model. Or you might use statistical algorithms to take those Earth system model projections and bring them to a higher resolution, either spatially or temporally, that you might need to do something like run it through your stormwater model. If you're thinking about something like a social cost calculation for the EPA, you might take these Earth system model projections of particular climate scenarios and use them to train a climate emulator or a simple climate model that lets you explore a more continuous scenario space that you might need for a social cost calculation. So this is going to give you a different form of sort of climate data. But then those sort of meteorological parameters or climate parameters are then fed through some sort of an impact model or a damage function or some sort of a economic model that will give you a social cost calculation or how your storm pipe drain is going to work. Okay, and that's what's actually going to go into your climate risk assessment. And at each of these steps, there's a lot of assumptions that are made. And what I'm going to try to show you some case studies of is that those assumptions tend to obscure the unique effect that these aerosol changes that we're expecting over the next 30 years are going to produce for climate risk. So starting with this first sort of part of our chain, regional climate models or statistical algorithms that are used to bring Earth system model output to higher resolution often omit aerosol processes altogether. So a lot of regional climate models don't actually allow aerosols to change at all within them. So you might end up completely missing an aerosol signal, and I'll show an example of that in a moment. And then these emulators and these simple climate models often will just use global average conditions and scale things based on global average conditions. And what I showed you from that patchy distribution of aerosols is that the global average often is not a good predictor of what the effect of the aerosol is going to be, particularly in a given region, and as the distribution of where aerosols are emitted changes through time. So both of these strategies are going to obscure how regional aerosol emissions and the way that they change through time are going to impact the sorts of outcomes that matter for climate risk. And then when we think about feeding these sort of meteorological or climate parameters into an impact model, we have to make sure that our impact model is capable of capturing the types of climate shifts that are going to be produced by the climate forcings that are going to be happening. So what we tend to see is that a lot of these impact models are built around greenhouse gas driven damages. And if the aerosols are going to impact that societal factor, say crop yields or something, differently than greenhouse gases do, your impact model may not capture that if it's built around a greenhouse gas driven damage. And I'll show an example of that in a minute. And so the net outcome of all of this is that most of our near-term climate risk assessments tend to either not include aerosol effects, or they treat them as just sort of a global offset to greenhouse gases. And what I'm hopefully going to convince you of is that you can't think about the aerosols as just a symmetric offset to the greenhouse gases. Their effect on the climate system, and especially trickling down through these impacts, is sufficiently distinct that they have to be treated independently. So I'm going to start with a little case study that shows the consequences of the way that regional climate models emit these aerosol processes. And this comes out of work that's been done in Europe. There's a massive regional climate modeling enterprise there that produces higher resolution climate data that's actually used widely across European planning agencies. And so what this is showing you is summertime average temperatures. I believe this is projected for mid-century over Europe. And what these different dots are in different colors is the orange ones here are sort of native Earth system model projections of what will happen with summertime temperatures over Europe. And the green dots here are a regional climate model whose boundaries are fed with the information from these parent Earth system models. Okay, so you take the Earth system model evolution through time, you give that to the regional climate model as a boundary condition, and then the regional climate model kind of does its higher resolution version of the calculations to give you higher resolution data in your regional domain. So you can see that there's an offset between what the regional climate models produce over Europe and what the parent Earth system models produce at coarser resolution. And the European models are systematically biased cooler than the Earth system models. Now, these Euro-Cortex regional climate models, none of them include the evolution of aerosols into the future over that European domain. So within these models, the same aerosols that are there right now remain there going into the future. So the effect of European reductions in air pollution is not captured in this. And that is the main reason why these have that cool bias. they keep that cooling effect from the aerosols into the future, even though the Earth system models are showing that air pollution being drawn down and the warming being revealed. And so what's on the right-hand side here is a version, a sort of a replication of those runs, now using on the left-hand side an Earth system model, and on the right-hand side a comparable regional climate model that does have interactive aerosols. And so now the parent Earth system model on the left and the regional climate model on the right are aligned. You know, once you have the interactive aerosols in there, you remove that bias. Okay. So this is just showing an example of a situation where by not including the aerosol evolution in the tool that you're using to build your understanding of the evolution of your local climate, you're going to be probably underestimating the severity of warming that you can expect to see in the future. Right? So you can imagine, let's say you're a European Public Health Agency and you're trying to decide how much money to put towards heat wave mitigation or heat wave resilience going into the future. You may make a different investment decision if you're working with this data set versus this data set, right? Okay, so this is an example of the situation where this emission of aerosol processes is going to obscure the effect of or modify your sense of how your impact is going to evolve. And I want to give you guys another example of how this global average approach is also problematic, right? So on this other pathway, and this is often one that's used for things like social cost calculations, this is really where we tend to see this simplification that aerosols are a global mean offset to the greenhouse gases. And so I just want to show you an example of a situation where the actual spatial pattern and the spatial distribution of the aerosol effect is really important for the magnitude of impacts that you get out. So this is work that's been done by my master's student, Cameron Cummins. And here we've been looking at the impact of the evolving spatial pattern of aerosol emissions on heat wave hazard and exposure through time. So here I'm just showing you the same figure that I showed you before that decomposed that historical temperature evolution into the contribution from greenhouse gases versus aerosols. And so we've been using the same data set that was used to generate this. This is the large ensemble data set from the community Earth system model. And we've been using it to decompose the role of aerosols in the evolution of heat wave hazard and exposure, both over the historical period and into future projections. And this was motivated by that figure that I showed you before, right? That shows that the distribution of aerosols is co-located with where people are living. So we had this sort of starting hypothesis that aerosols, because of their particular spatial distribution, would have an outsized impact on heat wave exposure in particular. So exposure here being the hazard multiplied by the number of people who are in the place where the hazard is happening. And that would be true due to the fact that they have these localized effects that tend to be co-located with population centers. But then we also theorize that this would change through time, right? Where these aerosol emissions have happened has evolved a lot over time. So we hypothesize that this effect, this sort of amplification of exposure and who is being affected would also change through time. So what I'm showing you here is results from our analysis of heat wave intensity and frequency in that data set. So what I'm showing you is the evolution of the global mean number of heat wave days per year from around 1930 through present day, and then into one particular scenario of projections for the future. The green line here is showing you how the global number of heat wave days would have evolved in a world without aerosol changes since 1920. So if you had taken the distribution of aerosols in 1920 and just kept it the same through time, this is the evolution of heat wave hazard you would have had. And then in black is showing you what actually happened, at least according to the model. And so you can see, right, that the evolution of aerosols since 1920 has actually suppressed heat wave risk overall, or it's suppressed heat wave hazard overall. And what these vertical lines are showing you is actually basically the slope of these curves through 30-year periods, sort of rolling 30-year periods. And where those bars are blue, it's showing you periods where the effect of the aerosols is decelerating the growth of heat wave hazard. right? So heat wave hazard is growing through time under both of these scenarios. But in this early period, the aerosols are acting to slow down that growth, and the changes in aerosols through time is acting to slow down that growth. But then somewhere around right now, these bars switch over to red, which is telling you that the change in aerosols through time is actually accelerating this heat wave hazard. Okay, so the aerosols on their own cool climate and reduce the hazard. But as they change, right, if they're increasing, they're going to decelerate hazard. But if they're decreasing, they're going to accelerate hazard. Okay, and so what we actually see is that we get this changeover where the aerosol effect is still suppressing heat wave hazard overall, but the changes through time are actually accelerating heat wave hazard. So this is an important piece of how this spatiotemporal evolution of the aerosol is actually quite important for how we think about risk, because the acceleration of a hazard is actually really important for whether we can adapt to it or not. So this is just showing that the presence of aerosols, it has and will suppress heat wave hazard globally, but we may have already crossed this point where aerosol changes through time go from decelerating to accelerating increases in heat wave hazard. So if we now think about the exposure piece, we do actually see that initial hypothesis that we had is confirmed. So here what I'm showing you in the magenta line is basically the difference between this green and black line. So it's just showing you the aerosol signal. So if you just focus on the magenta line, you can see that we have this, it stays below 0 throughout the whole period. So that's capturing this fact that the aerosols suppress heat wave hazard overall. But you can see the slope is negative initially and then positive. So this is capturing the fact that it's decelerating the change in heat wave hazard initially and then accelerating it. And then the purple line is showing you the same calculation, but now population weighted. So this is a metric of the exposure, right? And so the fact that the purple line is below the magenta line, right? It's more extreme than the magenta line, is demonstrating the fact that the aerosol effect is preferentially occurring where people are located. So that means that the aerosols are suppressing heat wave hazard more strongly where people are located. So it's suppressing, it has an outsized effect on heat wave exposure. But that also means that the deceleration and acceleration effect is preferential, is amplified in exposure relative to hazard. Right, so aerosol suppression and acceleration of heat wave hazard is preferentially happening where people are located, meaning that the exposure effects are stronger than the hazard effects. Okay, and this is not as true for greenhouse gases as it is for aerosols. Okay, so this hopefully is just an example of how that particular spatial distribution of the aerosols is important when we start thinking about these actual risk drivers like exposure. And then lastly, I just want to show you an example of this idea of whether or not our impact models are built to capture the particular damages that we expect from aerosols. And this is from a set of studies that I did starting about 7 years ago now, where we wanted to understand how the particular effect of the location where the aerosols are coming from affects the climate impact. So we did a set of climate model simulations where we took the same chunk of aerosol, which was about what China was emitting at the turn of the century, and we simulated putting those same emissions in one of these 8 places. So we had 8 different scenarios for each of these places. And then we looked to see what the climate impact looked like across those different, just based on that difference in the source location. So from a physical climate perspective, the main thing that we found is that identical aerosols produce really different climate responses depending on where they're emitted. So this is just showing you in sort of one slide that result. This is showing the global mean surface temperature change and then the global mean slow precipitation change, which is most of the precipitation response, depending on which of the 8 regions you put that chunk of aerosol in. Okay, and so you can see it goes from like actually having a slight warming effect when you put that aerosol in India versus having almost a half a degree of a cooling effect when that same aerosol is in Europe. So big differences in the global mean, but there's also big differences in the spatial distribution. And we see that really strongly when we start thinking about societal impacts. So one of the things that we did with these simulations is we took the sort of physical system responses like temperature and precipitation that I just showed you, and we collaborated with some economists and social scientists who focus on building these impact models. And we basically took our physical responses and ran them through a range of different impact models and damage functions, including impacts on infant mortality, crop yields, economic productivity, so on. And it let us build these maps of how aerosols in a given place impacted things like excess infant deaths, crop production, GDP. So we could actually map the relationship between aerosol emissions in a given location and societal impacts everywhere on the planet, at least in this one model. Okay, so I just want to show you an example from the crop results that highlights the importance of capturing the aerosol-specific damages. So what this graph is showing you is the impact of aerosols emitted in one of the 8 regions on total crop yields across the world. And one of the things we can do with these damage functions is the damage functions take in a bunch of different meteorological variables, and they produce a change in crop yields. But you can actually identify which of those variables is driving your total crop yield change by holding one of them constant at a time, okay? So that's what this graph is, that decomposition is what this graph is doing. So the thick bars are showing you the total crop yield impacts. So for example, this part of the bar graph is showing you that putting that chunk of aerosol in Brazil reduces global mean crop yields by about 10 megatons. But then these smaller bars are showing you the contribution to that total from changes in aerosol optical depth, which is a measure of basically the effect of aerosols on radiation, which solar radiation, important for crop growth, right? So this is capturing that radiative effect of the aerosol. And then dark blue is temperature, medium blue is precipitation. And so one of the things that you might think about here is if you were just thinking about the effects of greenhouse gases on crop yields, you would not consider aerosol optical depth, right? So if you built a crop model that thought about greenhouse gases, you might think about precipitation, temperature, maybe CO2 fertilization. But what this graph is showing is that if you look at the difference between the thick bar and the light blue AOD bar, you'll see that there are many situations where if you only thought about temperature and precipitation, you would have a very different perception of the impact of aerosols on crop yields than when you include this AOD effect. So if you are trying to run the aerosol climate signal through a crop model that's built only for greenhouse gases, you are going to completely misrepresent the effect on crop yields. Okay, so this hopefully highlights why we need to be thinking about the unique way that aerosol emissions are going to affect these different societal parameters when we're building our impact models. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that near-term climate risk estimates and the way that they are currently neglecting aerosol effects is actually a really important missing piece that we need to be thinking about more strategically. So of course, I could just complain at you, but I'll try to give some recommendations for what we could be doing differently, much of which my research group is really trying to help with. So one area that we're really trying to push in is just starting with what scenarios for aerosol emissions the community at large is seeing. And these come out of these thing called integrated assessment models that are sort of big socioeconomic models for how society may evolve and what emissions we might produce as a result. And so some of our recommendations here are to increase the diversity of realistic evolution in aerosol emissions so that we are capturing all of the uncertainty that comes from that. And for those of you who think about climate modeling, CMIP7 is going to be the next venue where climate models are doing this. So we're really trying to push to make sure that diversity is there in this next generation of model projection output. And then also just being really clear about what assumptions are driving what happens to aerosol emissions in the future. At the moment, it's often very naive and it's very much a black box. So if we think they're important, we should be being more careful about that. Certainly, there's lots of job security for Earth system modelers and aerosol climate researchers like myself. There's a lot that we still need to do to make sure that these models are simulating the effect of aerosols properly. And if we didn't think they were important for climate, maybe we would care about that less. But given what we now understand about their impact on climate, we have to make sure that we're getting all the pieces of that right. I'm going to skip over some of these dedicated modeling efforts, unfortunately, but feel free to ask me about regional aerosol MIP if you so wish. And then when we start thinking about some of the users of this data, we're really trying to get in touch with those communities, make them aware that they need to be thinking about aerosols when they're building their climate risk assessments. If they don't even know this is an issue, they're probably not even asking their climate service provider whether their simulations include this or not. And then, of course, we want people to be thinking about this in policy and giving us money to do the work. So we're kind of going across a bunch of different venues trying to reinforce this idea. And the hope is that eventually we'll get to a place where we both have all of the science that we need to characterize the impact of these aerosol changes, particularly over the next 30 years, and have actual institutional infrastructure in place to be thinking about this appropriately and responsibly in our climate risk assessments. So with that, I will say thank you, and I'm really looking forward to questions, feedback, discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Geeta. We'll take some questions.
Well, I got the microphone. So
Okay.
I'm sitting next to the guy with who had it.
Strategic.
Yeah, it was strategic. So this is an awesome talk, Geeta. Thanks so much. I'm curious, you showed us, right, that where the aerosols are emitted has a big effect.
Yeah.
And I was drawn back to the map that you showed at the beginning with the kind of the consensus of how the global system is affected. And I guess my question is the time horizon too long to be thinking about the cascading effects? Like, for example, increasing aridity in the Eastern Pacific driven by Southeast Asian aerosol emissions, which then you get more aerosols coming out of, say, California because you've aridified. Does that factor in, or is that just too many decades out? You don't even
It is
care?
not too many decades out, and I would argue that it should factor in, but we don't have the modeling systems in place to have it factor in. So most climate models do not have interactively generated dust in that way. The dust is often generated maybe by interactive winds in the model, and maybe it has some idea of what's happening with soil moisture, but it's not sophisticated enough to capture that sort of feedback. Another place is wildfire emissions. This is a big place where we think that the effect of climate on wildfire emissions could produce wildfire aerosol that then affects climate, that then affects fire weather risk, but the models right now don't interactively generate wildfire emissions. So one of the hopes is that by demonstrating the quantitative importance of those signals, it'll incentivize investing in actually representing them well. Yeah.
Okay, quick one before some of us have to run. I'm trying to understand the physics difference between the places where it looks like it's increasing precipitation versus decreasing precipitation. Could you help us a little bit?
So part of it has to do with whether the precipitation locally is generated primarily by convective precipitation or more sort of like large-scale stratiform precipitation. So that's one piece of it. Another piece of it is whether so your aerosols can both scatter and absorb radiation. And the way that changes the vertical stability of the atmosphere plays a big role in how it affects the precipitation. So depending on whether your precipitation effect is driven by the way that it's changing the circulation pattern versus just the way that it's changing the local thermodynamics, that can give you different signals in the precipitation response. Yeah, and this is there's a whole talk to be given just on that. Yeah.
Great talk, really interesting.
Thanks.
I have a question about models and the state of models. So, there are several, global climate models. It looks like you work with the CESM.
Yeah, primarily. Mm-hmm.
And then there are regional models, which obviously need to incorporate. So what I'm wondering about is the level of integration. Like, are there preliminary models, is specifically CSM, that are incorporating the regional models and the changes? So I'm trying to figure, where's the state of the modeling towards incorporating the aerosols? And how much detail do you have?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different approaches. This question of how you get higher resolution in climate model projections is like a universal issue, not just with thinking about the aerosol driven piece. And so the climate modeling community has been taking a bunch of different approaches to this. One is to try to do what they call variable resolution models or nested models, where you can basically increase the spatial resolution of your global model, but just in one little domain of interest. And so maybe you do that by stretching your grid so that it's lower resolution on the other side of the planet and high resolution right there, or maybe you nest. And then the other approach has been to try to just make your global model high resolution everywhere. And so as we get faster computational resources, that becomes more possible, but it actually reveals new physics problems also, because you start having to represent explicitly processes that you were able to sort of parameterize on average before. And so that often means that you have to develop new physics for your model. And so that's its own thing. Yeah. 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 Right. At the regional scale, you mean, or? Right. Yeah. So the global models are all capable of representing this. It's the regional models that typically have not been optimized. They've decided they want to use their computational effort elsewhere, essentially. And so global models are typically what will be used to demonstrate the types of things that I demonstrated about the effect of aerosol emissions in different places. But that happens with like somebody going in and telling the Earth system model, this is the distribution of aerosols that are happening. Tell me what the climate system response is. So someone has to decide that they want to go run that simulation to get that physical response. Yeah.
So in a world of limited funding, you can build bigger models, but you can also collect a lot more data. So,
yes.
And I'm not disparaging models, but the models depend on the data. So, so where is the sticking point on collecting more data?
So for aerosols, one of the biggest barriers is figuring out the vertical distribution of the aerosols, so where they actually end up in the atmosphere once they're emitted. And one of the reasons that's important is for these precipitation effects. So the thermodynamic impact of the aerosol is going to be totally different if it's at the surface versus if it's like above your cloud field. And satellites cannot do that. There have been all sorts of different approaches to try to figure that out, but it's all imperfect. So people try to do aircraft measurements, but that's obviously one point in time, one location. So figuring out some sort of like global, temporally continuous measure of the vertical distribution of aerosol would be a game changer. And then also having measurements of how aerosols age in the atmosphere would be really valuable. So I talked about these aerosols as being these different species, but the reality is once they're in the atmosphere, they mix with each other and their radiative properties change the longer they are in the atmosphere. So an aerosol may actually go from being scattering when it first gets into the atmosphere to being absorbing once it mixes with other stuff. And that is something that we don't really have comprehensive observations to characterize. And the models, arguably, because we don't have observations for it, we don't know if they're doing it right or not. Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of on the theme of geoengineering and climate,
Yeah.
is there anywhere where there's like sulfate aerosol emissions could have a net cooling without any of the terrible air pollution problems, like in shipping, for example, or are these sort of teleconnections always going to be bad?
So Danielle has actually done some work on that and can maybe speak to that a little bit more. But my sense, one of the strategies that the SAI community has been thinking about is you can try to do stratospheric aerosol injection instead, so that the aerosol that has a few advantages in the sense that it is, if it's in the stratosphere, it's going to last longer. It's not going to get rained or gravitationally deposited out as fast. And it's also easier to therefore get it distributed over large areas. And then also you're not at the surface, so you don't get the air pollution impacts immediately. And so people have actually tried to take these approaches where they inject in the stratosphere in a particular pattern. So one of the issues with aerosol geoengineering is that you produce these hydroclimate impacts that can generally end up being net negative, or at least would be geopolitically really problematic. And so some recent studies have tried to like figure out, is there a particular spatial pattern of sulfate that you could put into the, or aerosol that you could put into the stratosphere that would somehow have zero effect on hydroclimate, it would balance out. And so far, my understanding is that that has not been successful. So my take is that there are too many interacting effects for us to be confident that we could geoengineer with aerosols and get exactly the outcome that we were hoping for. So, yeah. Bummer.
Great, thank you. I'll try to end it on time-ish, 1 minute. So, thanks Geeta so much
Thank you
for
guys. It was
giving
really
us a
fun.
great talk.
Good questions.